So everything's working. So good morning. How are you? I'm great. I'm so happy to be here. I'm really excited to be here back at CARE, this time in Warsaw, today talking about the subject of my new book, which is called Powerarchy. Actually, after this talk, I'm going to have a book signing upstairs at our table there, and I'll try to remember to mention a little bit more about that at the end of this talk. So before I explain what Powerarchy is, I want to share some examples with you of what it looks like. And I want to start with a quote from someone you've probably heard of. Take a minute to read this quote. Now, who do you think said this? Any guesses? Well, if you guessed Gandhi, you guessed correctly. Now I want to share another example. I'd like you to imagine the following scenario. So Joe and Brenda here are students, and they're also a couple. Now, Brenda proudly tells Joe, sorry, I'm just going to move this mic because this is not working. So Brenda proudly tells Joe that after an exam that she had, she got a B+ on it, and she's excited about it. And he says, well, what are you so excited about? I mean, it's not like it was an A. And then she says, well, at least I didn't get a C on my English final. To which Joe replies, well, at least I didn't fail out of my freshman seminar. You know where this is going, right? And so on. So does this sound familiar to you? Have you ever had an experience like this? Seen an experience like this? Probably a lot, maybe in different types of situations. So the question is, why are people who care about each other actually hurting each other? We do this all the time. Here's another example of Powerarchy. Now, probably most people in this room, maybe everybody in this room is vegan. So let's imagine that you are at a dinner party and with non-vegans. And the non-vegans are served a stew, a beef stew that looks like this. Some of you know where I'm going with this. And when one non-vegan asks the host for the recipe, the host says, well, the secret is in the meat. You need to use golden retriever flesh. So how do you imagine the non-vegans would react upon hearing this news? Not exactly happy. Now, one final example I want to share is from Michael Singer's book called The Untethered Soul. And Michael Singer says in this book, he says, imagine you have a roommate who follows you everywhere you go. And this roommate shares an incessant stream of mostly negative commentary on everything you experience. They criticize your choices. They call you lazy. They tell you you're stupid. They tell you all the reasons you should be constantly worried. They're always telling you that you're not good enough and you probably never would be. How would you feel if you had this roommate following you everywhere you go? Well, Michael Singer says this is actually your inner roommate. This is the voice in your head that's with you everywhere you go, at least for most people. Can you relate to this? Most of us carry around this inner roommate. Now, all of these examples I just shared with you, they might look like different situations, and in some ways they are different situations, but they all have a common denominator. What do you think their common denominator is, if you have to guess? What do they all have in common? To some degree, yeah, you're right. They all reflect relationships. The relationship between Gandhi and the so-called natives, the relationship between individuals and the couple, the relationship between the person eating meat and the animal that once was, the relationship between you and yourself. More specifically, they reflect a particular way of relating that reflects a particular mentality. Now, to help explain this phenomenon that I'm talking about, I'd like you to think of a relationship in your life that you consider a good relationship. Maybe you consider it a great relationship. Think of somebody that you're in a good relationship with. And I don't mean just a romantic relationship. This could be a friendship. This could be a teacher of yours, a family member. And now think about your experience, how you feel in this relationship. Specifically, think about your feeling of connection. Do you feel connected with this person? How connected do you feel? Think about your feeling of dignity. This is your feeling of inherent worth. I am a fundamentally worthy person. I'm not less than anybody else on this planet. How do you feel with this person? Do they help you to feel that you have worth, that you matter? Now think about this person's behaviors toward you. When this person interacts with you, do they treat you with integrity? That means, do they practice compassion or caring and justice, which is fairness toward you? Think about their behavior. And now think about when you're with this person or in this relationship, is it easy or is it challenging to be your better self, the you that you like? Is it easier for you to feel empowered? Can you all relate to this? You have somebody in your life who you feel this way with. Now think about how you feel when you are in the presence of or interacting with somebody who you don't have a good relationship with. Maybe it's somebody from the past you don't have a relationship with at all anymore. Maybe it's an online troll or somebody who you only know online. Think now about your experience of connection. How do you feel about your dignity? Do you feel like you matter? Do they treat you with integrity? Is it easy or is it difficult for you to feel that you can be your better self, that you can be empowered? Do you have to work to be a good person in their presence? So basically, each of these relationships falls on a different side of the relational spectrum, the relational continuum. Relationships and interactions, right? Interactions are just like mini relationships, can be more or less relational, non-relational. They can be more or less healthy or dysfunctional. They can create more of a sense of disconnection, or they can create connection. Does this make sense so far? Good, because it's 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'm hoping you had enough coffee so that you can be with me on this. Naturally seek meaningful connection with others, and we naturally try to avoid the pain of disconnection in our lives, in our relationships. We also know that we are hardwired for empathy, and that feeling empathy tends to increase the chances that we'll act in ways that enhance connection. And we know that healthy relational behaviors are fundamental to the well-being of individuals and also of societies. Think about healthy societies. They reflect healthy relational behaviors, behaviors that reflect integrity and honor dignity. And yet, when you look at the world, you can see that non-relational ways of being prevail. Non-relationality is the norm. I don't have to tell you guys this in this room. You're well aware of this. So the question for us is, what's getting in the way of us relating the way that we want and need to? What is it that is causing this relational paradox whereby we create the very thing that we actually want to avoid? Well, I have been pondering this question for a very long time. In fact, my mother actually told me that I was born old. And when she said that, it wasn't a compliment. But seriously, I have been thinking about this question. The catalyst for me to actually ponder this experience happened when I was very young, which is why my father, who's the Republican fisherman, blames himself for the fact that I turned into an activist. What happened was that when I was very young, I was on my parents' boat, which was my favorite place in the world to be, and I was fishing with them. I had never really caught a fish before, but on this particular day, I did catch a fish. My little fishing pole was sticking on the side of the boat, and suddenly the line became taut, and my parents ran over and said, Mellie, you've caught a fish. And they were so excited, and they helped me reel it in, and they were celebrating this accomplishment of mine. And I just stood there and I watched as we pulled this beautiful creature out of the ocean. My father ripped her off the hook and threw her in a bucket of other fish to suffocate to death, and I couldn't feel happy. I couldn't feel happy. And I didn't know what was wrong with me. I mean, I was too young to really understand what was going on. It was like my brain and body didn't understand what was happening to me. I was too young to really understand the emotions I was experiencing. I just knew that I felt bad. And so my father's boat, which had been my favorite place in the world to be, actually became really distressing for me. So I couldn't go on it anymore after that. And seafood, which had been my favorite food, started to make me sick. I actually couldn't eat seafood anymore without vomiting after that. So it's like my emotions and body were reacting to a paradox that my mind was too young to understand. I couldn't reconcile how caring people could harm others and neither see nor feel troubled by this contradiction. I mean, my parents had instilled in me, they had taught me to practice the golden rule. You guys know the golden rule, right, here? And this applied also to how we treat animals. I mean, we had a family dog who we saw as a member of our family. We treated him like he was a member of our family. And I witnessed the violation of this supposedly highest principle, the golden rule, not only toward the way that people were treating animals, I witnessed it everywhere. For example, when I was growing up in the 1970s, my mother was a single parent, and her salary was low enough so that we had to get food stamps to pay for our lunch at school, and my brother and I couldn't afford to have new clothes that fit us properly often to wear to school. And this, of course, made me a prime target for bullies who would tease me and yell at me for being poor and disgusting, all right in the presence of unconcerned teachers who turned away from the bullying. And as a young woman in the 1980s, I got very used to men yelling out their car windows at me on pretty much a daily basis, often describing sexual acts that they wanted to treat me to, and then calling me a bitch, or worse, when I ignored them in an attempt to manage my anxiety. So like most women during that era, I was harassed by men pretty much constantly in a wide variety of ways. So these experiences and many, many more experiences led me to be pondering this relational paradox. But it took something extreme for me to actually start actively searching for answers to it. And as it turned out, it was another incident involving an animal, only this time in the form of a hamburger. And some of you guys know this story already, but I was 23 years old in 1989, and I got sick after eating a contaminated hamburger. I wound up actually in the hospital on antibiotics, and after eating that, I stopped eating meat. I never wanted to eat meat. This is the story of my life. I never wanted to eat meat again. I just became disgusted. So I became a vegetarian at the time, sort of by accident. And after stopping eating meat, I wanted to learn information about my new diet, which led me to information about animal agriculture, which shocked and horrified me. I couldn't believe the reality of what was happening in the world. But what shocked me perhaps even more was that nobody I talked to about this experience, about what I had learned, was willing to hear what I had to say. They'd say things like, "Don't tell me that, you'll ruin my meal." Or they would call me a crazy vegan hippie propagandist. So I couldn't understand how rational and caring people could turn away from atrocities. People who had been just like myself. What was it that caused people to resist the very information that would enable them to act on their caring? And it was this experience that led me to do my research on the psychology of eating animals. I focused on the psychology of nonviolence and violence, and then I wrote my dissertation on the psychology of eating animals, and that's the dissertation, the doctoral dissertation that turned into my best-selling book, Why We Love Dogs, Eat Pigs, and Wear Cows, an introduction to carnism that I think a lot of you here are familiar with. But my research actually led me to discover something far broader than just the psychology of eating animals. I identified the psychological mechanisms, the mentality, actually, that drives all oppression and abuse. And also how that mentality is informed by and informs external social structures. I had sort of a blueprint with which to understand the deeper psychological drivers of oppression and abuse. Oppression and abuse. Oppression, just to differentiate, is usually the word when we describe abuse on a massive level, a larger level that's institutionalized. Abuse is usually the word we use when we talk about interpersonal or small group interactions, but the dynamics are the same. Now, usually, when scholars and activists think about oppression, when they examine oppression, they do this through the lens of economics or of politics or philosophy or maybe sociology, right? And of course, these lenses matter. They help us see different aspects of oppression. But we also need to look at oppression through the lens of relationships. And this is really important, and this is the central idea of what I'm trying to communicate today and with my book. Because my research and the research of others that I've built on actually shows that on a deeper level, oppression is a relational phenomenon. More specifically, oppression reflects and reinforces relational dysfunction, okay? It reflects a dysfunction in how we relate to other individuals, how we relate as social groups, how we relate to other animals, how we relate to the environment, how we relate to ourselves. Oppression is a relational phenomenon in many ways. And so, unless we change the way we relate, we will not end oppression. It's not enough to just target the external manifestations of oppression. We need to focus on the deeper relational mentality and behaviors that drive oppression. Now, I also realize that this oppressive mentality, this non-relational mentality, is based on a core belief. It's driven by a core belief, the belief in a hierarchy of moral worth, the belief that some individuals and groups are more worthy of moral consideration. That means of being treated with integrity, of being treated with respect than others. Think about Gandhi's statement, for example. Gandhi only argued that the, quote, natives should be treated differently than the Indians because on some level, he believed the natives were less worthy of moral consideration, that they were morally inferior. And I realized that this mentality of oppression, this non-relational mentality, didn't exist in a vacuum. When so many individuals have the same belief, that means it's very likely the product of a widespread belief system. For example, the belief that men are seen as more worthy of moral consideration than women, or humans are seen as more worthy of moral consideration than animals. These don't exist. These beliefs don't exist in a vacuum. They are the result of isms, of patriarchy or sexism or of speciesism, for example. So I therefore came to identify the belief system that I call powerarchy. Powerarchy is a non-relational system that's based on this belief in a hierarchy of moral worth. And as its name suggests, it is based on, it is organized around exercising power over others. What this means is that we learn to derive our sense of power, to feel more powerful, and also to derive our sense of worth, to feel more worthy from wielding power over others, from comparing ourselves to others and placing ourselves on a higher rung on the ladder of powerarchy. So the story of the students I shared earlier is a perfect example of this. When one person feels put down, the way they make themselves feel better is by doing what? Putting the other person down. I mean, you guys, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know because you have been living this all your lives. You know this. You've experienced it. I'm just giving words to something that you have an intuitive awareness of. We all do this. We put each other down very often to boost ourselves up. We take power from others in order to feel more powerful from ourselves. This is practicing power over. When we try to have more power than others, we inevitably create power imbalances between us. In fact, powerarchy as a system is structured to maintain and often grow unjust power imbalances. And I'm using the word unjust for a reason. These are unfair power imbalances. Some power imbalances are not unjust, like the power imbalance between, for example, a parent and a child. Okay? So think, for example, about the power imbalance between men and women, or between humans and non-humans, or the power imbalance between an abusive partner and the person being abused. The imbalance exists, and the system is set up to keep that power imbalance in place, to prevent one group or individual from having power, and to make sure the other one holds on to power. And often, the system grows that power imbalance. Now, most people would not willingly support powerarchy because the system is counter to core human values, and powerarchy, as I have said, it creates the very outcomes that most of us want to avoid. Most of us we seek meaningful connection with others, and powerarchy drives us to create disconnection. So powerarchy uses defense mechanisms. These are psychological mechanisms, mostly, to keep itself alive. The whole system is set up. These defense mechanisms prevent us from seeing powerarchy in the first place. And if we do see powerarchy, they prevent us from challenging powerarchy. These defenses fall into two main categories. Myths, these are stories that the system tells us about the way things are and the way things are supposed to be. So, for example, one of the myths you might be familiar with, eating animals is normal, natural, and necessary. Heterosexual supremacy is normal, natural, and necessary. What these myths do is they distort our perceptions. We don't see the unfair power imbalances, and we don't feel the natural emotions that would go along with recognizing those power imbalances. For example, humans who are eating animals disconnect from their natural emotion, their natural empathy. So we disconnect from our empathy, or we disconnect from our anger when we're on the lower end of powerarchy. Heterosexual supremacy is normal, natural, and necessary for many, many years. And today, people who do not identify as heterosexual, instead of feeling anger about that myth, what did they feel? Shame. Right? So these distortions prevent us from feeling our natural normal emotional response. And the system keeps itself alive through using privileges, right? Privileges are advantages that are given to some, but not others. So for example, humans have the privilege, the ability to eat other animals. Heterosexuals, quote unquote heterosexuals, had for many years and in some places today the privilege of being able to get married. And all forms of oppression share these same features. All forms of oppression share these same features. It can be helpful to think of oppressions as spokes on a wheel. So each spoke represents a different type of oppression, with powerarchy as like the hub, the center of that wheel. Powerarchy is like a meta system. It's the overarching system of oppression that the other systems stem from. And powerarchy also, it exists across all three relational dimensions. That means on the social level or the collective level, powerarchy teaches us how to relate as social groups. On the interpersonal level, between individuals, and on the intrapersonal level, to ourselves. So it exists across all these relational dimensions, and it also informs how we relate to other animals and how we relate to the environment. So it's like the backdrop for oppression. Now, of course, some forms of oppression inform others. So for example, sexism, and heterosexism and genderism are all informed by, or they stem from, the broader system of patriarchy, right? Just like anti-Semitism is informed by, or it stems from, the broader system of racism, or carnism stems from the broader system of speciesism. Make sense? Okay, so some forms of oppression are informed by others, and sometimes different forms of oppression sometimes intersect with others. So, for example, racism intersects with powerarchy to create a distinct category, woman of color. Make sense? So this is what we call, maybe you've heard of intersectionality. This is what intersectionality looks at, how oppressions intersect with one another. And while it's essential to become aware of the various forms and expressions of oppression, it's not enough to determine who is oppressing whom. We need to look at how and why we oppress. And specifically, we need to examine the deeper relational processes, the attitudes and behaviors that drive oppression, and also the social structures that reflect and reinforce them. Now, there are people who have been talking about this. More and more people are looking at the psychology of oppression, and some people are talking also just a little bit about oppression and relationality. It can be helpful, though, to think of this powerarchical mentality, this way of thinking, as an entity, like a being, that has taken up residence in your psyche. And think of this entity as having a survival instinct. It wants to keep itself alive. It needs you to keep it alive. And the way that it gets you to keep it alive is by getting you to find a morally inferior other. Think about your own experience. We all have this tendency, minute-to-minute tendency, to look at others and look at why they're wrong, look at why they're less than, look down on them, compare ourselves to them. And what powerarchy will do is create all sorts of justifications for why this person doesn't deserve to be treated with respect the same way others do or the same way we do. Today, the justification du jour is because we're morally outraged. We tend to believe because someone has done something we consider unethical, this gives us the right to violate our own integrity when we interact with them. It gives us the right to practice powerarchy against them. It's really important to appreciate that this hierarchy of moral worth is a myth. Each one of us is simply the product of our hard wiring of our brain and body and every experience we have ever had in our lives. We are nothing more nor less than this. When we expect somebody to be different from who and how they are, it's like expecting a tree that has been rained on not to be wet. I have no doubt that if I had been born into the body and brain of Ted Bundy, you might know the famous serial killer, and into his environment, I have no doubt that I would not be standing here advocating for social change, advocating for compassion. To be able to feel and advocate compassion is a privilege. This does not mean we don't hold people accountable and try to change behaviors. It simply means we do so in a way that honors their dignity, that doesn't perceive them as morally inferior. Now, it's also important to be aware that powerarchy is contagious. Powerarchy begets powerarchy. Proponents of nonviolent social change have long argued that if we use violence to fight violence, we'll end up with more of the same. And they're right. This idea is not just a philosophical notion. It's not just an abstraction. It's not just an intuition. This is supported by science. When we use powerarchy to challenge powerarchy, we end up with more powerarchy. Research has shown that when people feel that their dignity is harmed, that they're not being treated with respect, they become defensive. This means they're less rational, they're less empathetic. They're less likely to take positive action on their own or others' behalf. Research has also shown that they are more likely to react powerarchically. So if you use power over others, if you communicate with somebody in a way that's not respectful, they are more likely to react to you with power over and disrespect. Research has also shown that these people are more likely to use powerarchy against others. So, for example, when we communicate with somebody, we shame them, we're powerarchical to them. Maybe they won't do it back to us, maybe they will, but they will also possibly go home and do it to other people in their family, or go out on the street and do it to other people on the street. Powerarchy is contagious. Research has also shown that people automatically act and think powerarchically when they have power. And this is really interesting. Study after study has shown that when somebody is in a position of power, when you're a boss, for example, when you're a white person interacting with a person of color, when you're in a position of authority, when you're in a position of power, you have less empathy for people who have less power. You lose your connection with your empathy. You automatically feel more entitled to break the rules. You automatically feel that you can do things that are not allowed to others, even if that's not true. You feel more entitled. So as soon as we get more powerful, we tend to start even thinking powerarchically. Some researchers have even said that these types of behaviors that I call powerarchical behaviors spread like the common cold. They're that contagious. consider how systems that were created in order to challenge powerarchy, like social justice movements, can start becoming mini powerarchies, as more and more of the proponents of that system use powerarchy to show that powerarchy is wrong. So many of us are working toward change on the level of content, but our process is powerarchical. We speak out for justice, but we act in ways that are unjust. When we flip the ladder of powerarchy, we just end up with more of the same. We give some people power and they start acting more powerarchical. So what's the solution to powerarchy? How do we work toward transformation? Now, since the problem is caused by non-relational ways of being, the solution needs to be on creating healthy relational behaviors. We need to develop what I call relational literacy. That is the understanding of and ability to practice healthy relationality, to relate effectively. It never ceases to amaze me that most of us have to learn complicated geometry that we'll probably never need to use, and we don't get a single lesson, a single formal lesson on how to be healthy relational human beings. And when you look at the problems of the world, these are not problems that exist because people don't know how to do geometry. Most of what we learn from our parents in terms of how to relate. I don't know about you, but for many people, not great role models. We learn from our society, our culture, Hollywood. And on top of this, we have been born into a deeply dysfunctional, relationally dysfunctional world. It's like we live in the relational Middle Ages or the relational Dark Ages. Virtually every one of us has been relationally screwed up in one way or another. We can't avoid it, given the world we live in. I'm amazed that we make it through the day. I think people of the future are going to look back and say, oh my God, how did they do it? How did they live like that? So it's no wonder that we keep recreating these problematic behaviors. It's no wonder that we keep participating in relational dysfunction, even though what we really want is meaningful connection. But the good news is that each of us has the capacity to significantly increase our relationality, to significantly improve our relational literacy. I believe so strongly in the importance of relational literacy to change lives and the world that I actually wrote a whole book on the subject, which is going to be coming out in January. Now, one simple way, there's plenty of information out there. If each vegan committed to improving their relationality or spent as much time on improving relationality as we do on trying to figure out if somebody's been vegan enough, I think this movement would transform very quickly and become a lot healthier very quickly. One tip is simply to ask yourself, to pause throughout the day, to pause throughout interactions. Ask yourself, does my behavior reflect integrity? Does this person's behavior toward me reflect integrity? That's the key question. Now, relationality or relational literacy includes self-awareness. Self-awareness is critical because if we are not self-aware, we are easily hijacked by our emotions, and we can get reactive and just recreate powerarchy instinctively almost. This is what we tend to do. When we develop self-awareness, we're better able to notice when we're feeling the two emotions, these red flag emotions of contempt and shame. When you feel contempt, and I don't know how to translate this into the 20 languages that are here, but contempt is like judgment, in a sense, being judgmental, right? When you feel contempt, that means you've placed yourself in a position of moral superiority. When you feel shame, that means you perceive yourself in a position of moral inferiority. These are red flag emotions. They are relational emotions, and they are powerarchical realities, emotions. Notice when you're feeling contempt and ask yourself why. Notice when you're feeling shame and ask yourself why. In order to be able to do this, you need to develop your inner observer. Your inner observer is that part of you inside your mind that has always existed and that always exists, that's objective and it's compassionate. It's watching you move through your life. It's watching you experience the world. If you meditate, you're familiar with what I'm talking about. To develop your inner observer, set an alarm to go off throughout the day, 3 or 4 times a day. Pause, take a minute, and notice, what am I thinking? What is my inner roommate saying right now? What am I feeling? What do I need right now? Notice it. Don't do anything. Don't judge it. Just notice it with compassion. Be curious. Your inner observer is like a muscle. It gets stronger the more you exercise it. Relational literacy includes learning effective communication, since communication is the primary way we relate. Now, I have lots of resources on effective communication in my books, and I'll share some more with you. One tip is to do as Rumi suggested. When you are communicating or in a communication, ask yourself these 2 questions. Is it true? Do I know this to be true? Do I know this to be true, or is it maybe a story I'm making up or somebody else is making up? And is it kind? If the answer is no, it's probably best not to communicate. We have resources at veganadvocacy.org, and we'll be adding to these resources a lot over time. Some of my books go into detail in effective communication, and we have other books on this too. Ultimately, developing relational literacy helps and requires us. I know I'm almost out of time, but I started 5 minutes late, so I'm going to go just a couple more minutes.
That's okay.
Because I timed it to the minute. Developing relational literacy, it helps us to become and requires us to become more mindful. Mindfulness is actually the true opposite of powerarchy. Mindfulness is both a practice and it's a state of being. When we're more mindful, we're more aware, self-aware and aware of others. We're more present in the moment. When we're more mindful, we're more connected internally and externally. Many people who are much wiser than I am have, over the course of thousands of years, suggested that becoming more present or more mindful is the single most important undertaking any human being can do. And I agree with them. There are lots of ways to practice mindfulness. I recommend a website, headspace.com. It's got an app that makes it really easy to practice mindfulness. You can check out other apps if you like, but this one, I find works for me. So to wrap up, it is so important for those of us working toward change to understand powerarchy, because we need to make our movement a safe space where integrity is practiced and dignity is honored, even as we may disagree on tactics, on ideology, and on many other issues. We need to stop fighting each other and commit to healthy relating, or we risk cannibalizing ourselves and our movement. It's so important to remember that we are all a part of something much greater than our individual selves. We are part of a social justice movement that I believe will be looked back upon one day as one of the most important and transformational social movements in human history. And I really believe that if we can commit to relating healthfully, we can make this incredibly important movement the most powerful force it can be for the animals and ultimately for the world. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this speech.